In early 2016, Red Bull driver Daniil Kvyat seemed like he was on top of the world. He was in a race-winning car. The previous season, he had just beaten Daniel Ricciardo over the course of the year, and after 4 races, he also scored Red Bull's first, and up to that point, only podium of the year. However, after a bad home Grand Prix in Russia, he was out, replaced after 4 races, controversially in many people's eyes, and even having other F1 drivers come to his defense. In his place, Red Bull put an 18-year-old Max Verstappen in the car, and what happened next on Max's Red Bull debut was the sort of thing that you wouldn't believe if you saw it happen in a movie. But let's rewind back. How did Kvyat, despite seeming like he was on top of the world, end up in the middle of one of the most controversial driver swaps in F1 history? Usually when these high-profile driver swaps happen at top teams, most of the time it's because a driver in a fast car is under-delivering relative to their teammate and costing the team to the point where something has to change. The thing that made the Kvyat-Verstappen swap so controversial was that Kvyat wasn't necessarily under-delivering relative to Ricciardo. As mentioned earlier, he had just come off the back of beating Ricciardo in the 2015 championship by a narrow margin, and he also had just scored the team's first and only podium up to that point in China. This was not the same situation that Red Bull would later find themselves in with Gasly and Albon. The key to understanding why this swap happened when it did is to understand that the motivation behind it wasn't necessarily to do with Kvyat underperforming, but it was solely because Red Bull didn't want to lose Max Verstappen. According to articles at the time, when Verstappen agreed to join the Red Bull family and make his debut with Toro Rosso and rejected a deal with Mercedes to be their test and reserve driver for 2015, his contract stipulated that he would spend 2 seasons at Toro Rosso and then be promoted to Red Bull with a 2-year deal for 2017 and 2018. However, if Red Bull didn't offer him a promotion, then that would trigger an exit clause, meaning that he would become a free agent at the end of 2016. It was well known within the paddock that the likes of Mercedes and Ferrari were already interested in Verstappen, and so Red Bull weren't just going to allow someone to pinch a driver that they had spent so much to get. By the end of 2016, one of the Red Bull drivers was going to have to make way. But considering that Kvyat had just beaten Ricciardo in 2015, why was it him? Before I answer that, I do just want to quickly say that some of you might know that at the beginning of the season, me and fellow YouTuber Tomo put on our very first live show in London. Well, during the summer break, we will be back in a bigger venue, and this time with some very special surprise guests who will also be joining us on stage to chat. The live show will be on Friday, the 4th of August in London. Tickets are on sale right now. You can buy them using the link at the very top of the description. If you want to have a fun night chatting with us or laughing at our horrible F1 knowledge, or just meeting like-minded F1 fans, then definitely grab yourself a ticket, and I hope to see you there. It always felt like even though Kvyat was fast, he was definitely out of favour compared to Ricciardo. Keep in mind, a few years earlier, Ricciardo in his first season at Red Bull beat a 4-time world champion in Sebastian Vettel, and at the time Ricciardo was then a driver that everyone was touting as a future world champion. 2015 was undoubtedly a bad year for Ricciardo, but he still beat Kvyat in qualifying, showing that the raw speed was still there. However, he later admitted that there were off-track factors that affected his performance, which meant that even at the time, I think the team and even the wider F1 fanbase kind of felt that 2015 was just an off year for Ricciardo rather than the new norm, and that despite getting narrowly beaten by Kvyat, in 2016 the team still believed that he was the future instead of Kvyat. There was also the commercial aspect as well, which can't be underestimated. Kvyat was well liked, but the smiling Aussie was still a fan favourite. Even though this was in the pre-Drive to Survive era, Ricciardo's personality has always been infectious, and so for the Red Bull marketing machine, that is a factor that no doubt swayed the team even more in his favour. In the end, 2016 was going to be Kvyat's last season, almost regardless of what he did. The noise and hype around Verstappen was reaching fever point. Ricciardo also seemed to bounce back and had a clear advantage over Kvyat. He also had that credit by beating Seb in 2014, and then when you add the commercial advantages on top of that, for Kvyat, it wasn't a matter of if, but when. Even to start the season, Kvyat's form was starting to look worrying. In the opening 4 races, he qualified 18th, 15th, 6th, and 8th, and this also coincided with 2 races that pretty much changed his F1 career. Despite finishing on the podium in China, he had a very memorable incident with Seb on lap 1 when he dived down the inside of the Ferrari, causing Seb to take avoiding action, and by doing so he then crashed into Kimi, ruining Ferrari's race. And now, this was memorable more so for what then happened after the race in the cooldown room, with Seb famously dubbing Kvyat the torpedo for what he did on lap 1. And now, I have always maintained, controversially or not, that Kvyat did nothing wrong. If that was Max, Lewis or Fernando making that audacious dive, then I think people would be praising it as an aggressive overtake from a world champion. But I think because it was Kvyat and because it was Seb who had such a big reaction, it seemed like in terms of the public perception, it was Daniil who came away as the driver in the wrong. And the Seb factor in particular made it even worse looking at what then happened in the very next race in Russia. Going into turn 1, he initially locked up and went straight into the back of Seb, who as a result crashed into Ricciardo, ruining his race. Just a few seconds later, however, Kvyat then came back to finish the job, crashing into the back of Seb again, and this time putting him out of the race for good, ruining his, Seb's and his teammates' race in just 2 corners. Red Bull were looking for ammunition. They were looking for a reason to drop Kvyat, and Russia gave it to them on a silver platter. Speculation started to mount, and just 5 days later, it was official. Kvyat was out of Red Bull, going back to Toro Rosso, with Verstappen going the other way. Now, I was curious to get some insight from inside the team itself, and so there was no better person to ask than fellow YouTuber Blake, aka Break F1, who at the time was Kvyat's trackside performance engineer for 2015 and 2016, and then of course became Verstappen's performance engineer from Spain onwards. First up, I wanted to know how he found out about his driver being demoted, and also what his first impressions were of Max when he first walked into the factory.
So usually when you hear about some news in Formula 1, you almost always hear about it from Autosport or a journalist first, for sure. But the first time I heard that Daniil had been demoted was my boss, Rocky, called me and GP, the race engineer, who's now Max's race engineer, into the meeting room to have a quick chat. And he was like, right, here's what's happening. Danny's going to drive for Toro Rosso for the rest of the season, and Max is going to be in the car from Spain. He'll be in the simulator next week to prepare for the race. That's how it worked. My first experience or interaction with Max was in the simulator in preparation for the Spanish Grand Prix that year. And my initial impressions were, this guy is super young. He's just a super nice, super chilled out guy. And he was pretty quick in the sim, but at the end of the day, you don't take time. You don't take lap times from the simulator to say, hey, this person's good or not.
The Kvyat Verstappen swap definitely split opinions because whilst now I think we're a lot more desensitized to Red Bull swapping drivers, especially in their sister team, back then it was far from the norm, and it even had other drivers coming to Kvyat's defense. 2009 world champion Jenson Button tweeted saying, "Really? One bad race and Kvyat dropped? Or what about the podium in the previous race? Hashtag short memories." Hearing another F1 driver from another team openly criticizing Red Bull's choice to swap the drivers is pretty unheard of, and I think it just summarized the controversy of this swap because there was lots of sympathy towards Kvyat. Yes, he had one bad race, but there is a very long list of bad races by other Red Bull drivers in which they then didn't get sacked straight after. Going into Spain, there was the obvious media frenzy, and F1 wasted no time in putting both of the drivers shoulder to shoulder in the press conference. This was one of those awkward yet entertaining press conferences that you're happy that you're the one watching and not the driver being asked the difficult questions. Kvyat on his Toro Rosso return would have a solid enough race, finishing in P10, but this weekend was all about Max. Jumping into the car for the very first time, he managed to qualify in P4, just behind the dominant Mercedes, in front of both of the Ferraris, and only 4/10 behind teammate Ricciardo in third. Speaking about his first impressions of Max jumping into the Red Bull, here is what Blake had to say.
When Max hopped into the car in Spain, you could tell that he was definitely on it and he was going to be quick. We had to work on feedback and understand, just to learn the new driver's language and how they talk about the car. But the one thing I say wasn't really in Spain, it was a couple of races after that, and we started to notice he would go out in free practice one, absolutely ballistic, like right on the pace, right away, pushing like hell, and sometimes pushing over the limits and, damaging a front wing or something. But I think a lot of drivers are taken aback now by how quickly and how fast Max adapts and can push a car to the limit.
From there, well, I'm sure most of you know the rest. Max found himself at the right place and at the right time in history, in a season and year in general that was dominated by Mercedes, with them winning all but 2 races. This turned out to be one of those 2, as just a few corners into the race, both Lewis and Nico took each other out, opening up an opportunity for a surprise winner. From there, it was really all about strategy, because whilst initially it looked like it would be Ricciardo's race to win, with Max running in P2 and Vettel being the lead Ferrari behind, in both cases Red Bull and Ferrari opted to give their lead drivers a 3-stop strategy, with Max and Kimi running on the 2. That turned out to not just be the right strategy, but the winning call, as it gave Max and Kimi track position when they jumped their teammates, which, by the way, Ricciardo was livid about after the race, and after soaking up pressure from a pushing Raikkonen, the youngest driver in F1 was followed over the line by the oldest driver in F1 to win on his Red Bull debut and immediately write a brand new page in F1 history. He became by far the youngest F1 race winner at 18 years and 228 days old, the youngest driver to ever stand on an F1 podium, the first Dutch driver to ever win a Grand Prix, and also the first driver to win on debut for Red Bull. However, that was not just the first win and a special day for Max, as it was also the first win for Blake.
So when Max joined Red Bull Racing, that was his first win, but it was also my first Grand Prix win as an engineer on a car, and his race engineer GP, that was GP's first win in F1 as well. As soon as the Mercedes collided, you don't celebrate that moment that a team collides and is out of the race, but as soon as you realize, right, that's happened, we've got a shot at winning this race, and it was awesome. Fending off Kimi for the last couple laps of that race, as I remember, it's been ages since I've watched that race, but it was like, is he going to be able to keep Kimi at bay for the rest of this race? And it happened. It was an insane place and an insane moment in history, and I was emotional. I was very emotional, but it was quite a special day for me, and probably my proudest moment that I was a part of in motorsport history.
I think even to this day, Red Bull and especially Helmut Marko are still eating off the back of that Verstappen Kvyat swap success. I think it definitely makes Marko feel as though even when a decision doesn't go right, he can always point back to Max and what he's still doing right now as the ultimate license and justification for all of the driver decisions that don't go right. The harsh reality is that Red Bull has always been a numbers game. It's not about quality, it's not about nurturing drivers, it's about quantity in opportunity to find which drivers will deliver in against the odds situations. Even though Max is the ultimate benchmark and ultimate success story, I have never been fully convinced by Red Bull's trigger finger approach to promoting and demoting drivers. I think that whilst in the short term it delivered them a driver like Max, I can't help but feel like even to this day, outside of Max Verstappen, in the long term they're still failing to find a suitable and stable long-term partner at Red Bull. Or whether the ends always justify the means, I'll leave up to you to decide. But there's no doubt that the Kvyat Verstappen driver swap remains one of the most controversial and iconic moments in F1 history, especially for the movie-like ending that it delivered. Well, there you have it. Once again, don't forget to check out the link in the description for tickets to the Aldas and Tomo live show on Friday the 4th of August. And if you did enjoy this video, then don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.